Hello and welcome to Torah Thoughts. I want to point out real quick that in last week I posted a video and I said that Israel's enemies never came close to destroying Israel. And it's been pointed out to me that that's actually not true. Israel's enemies came very close to destroying Israel in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. In fact, it's arguably also true that they came close to destroying Israel in the War of Independence in 1948. So I stand corrected. Anyway, the portion of the Torah that we read this week's Parsha, is Noach. Noah. It's the story of Noah. And so in last week's Parsha, the Torah tells us about creation, about how God created the world. He created Adam and Eve. From Adam and Eve came humanity, and humanity spread, and they became evil. And so God decreed that that the entire population of the world will be destroyed except for Noach and his family. And so this week's Parsha opens up by introducing us to Noach. And it says, Eile toldot Noach. These are the children of Noach. And having been formally introduced to Noach, the Torah stops for a second and explains to us, who's Noach? Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav. Noach was a righteous and perfect man in his generation. Et Elokim hitalach Noach. Noach walked with God. So there's a concept in Judaism that God is perfect. God doesn't make mistakes. God wrote the Torah, which means the Torah is perfect and written without any mistakes. That means that any word or any letter, any syllable that seems to be written superfluously isn't. It's just there to teach us something, to teach us a lesson, and it's up to us to figure out what that lesson is. So, in this particular case, Rashi says to us, okay, it says, Noach ish tzadik tamim haya. Noach was a righteous, perfect man, bedorotav, in his generation. What does that mean, in his generation? Why was it necessary for the Torah to put in that word? It's obviously there to teach us something. So Rashi cites two opinions that are found in the Talmud, in the tractate of Sanhedrin, page 108, page 108a to be exact. And he cites a difference of opinion between two sages, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says that the word bedorotav, Noach was such a righteous and perfect man in his generation, teaches us that even in such an evil, corrupt generation, Noach managed not to be corrupted and not to be influenced, and he managed to be a righteous man. Imagine how righteous he would have been had he lived in any other generation. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, says he was a righteous man in his generation, meaning only relative to that generation. It was a very evil generation. So a man like Noach, who wasn't evil, was a righteous man. Had he lived in the time of, say, Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, he wouldn't have been considered a big deal. And Rashi also cites somewhat of evidence in favor of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, where a little bit later on in the Torah, Abraham says something along the lines of how he walked before God, Asher hitalachti lefanav. So we see from here that Abraham walked before God, whereas Noach walked with God. So the analogy being, picture a parent walking with their child. While the child is still learning to walk, the parent will hold the child's hand and walk with them. Once the child gets bigger, stronger, more capable, the child will let go of the parent's hand and walk before them on their own. So Avram was able to stand on his own 2 feet, so to speak, and he was able to walk before God. Noach, on the other hand, wasn't. He was righteous, but not as righteous. He needed to walk with God, so to speak, to hold God's hand. So there's a commentary. He's known in some cases as the Gur Aryeh. And the Gur Aryeh writes that actually Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish don't disagree. Well, they don't disagree fundamentally. They all both agree that Noach was a righteous man relative to his generation. They both agree on that. Rish Lakish doesn't dispute that. He wasn't as great as Avraham. He was only a great man relative to his. He was not a saint, a righteous man relative to his generation. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Rish Lakish that had he lived in any other generation, he would have been even more righteous. That yes, he was a great man relative to his generation, or only relative to his generation, but the reason for it is because of the limitations that he had. He was stuck living in a very evil and corrupt generation. So the only thing that they disagree on is what was the reason that God chose him as the survivor of humanity. He's going to be the man to restart humanity. Was it because had he lived in any other generation he would have been greater? Or was it simply because relative to this generation he was a righteous man, and that alone means a lot? In any event, the question that I'm asking is, having figured that out, right, having settled that dispute, which in fact isn't a dispute, Noach was a righteous man in his generation. Yes, we know that, relative to his generation, okay. And had he lived in another generation, he would have been greater. Why is that important to point out? Why is it important for the Torah to add that word, Bedorotav, in his generation, to teach us this particular lesson? I mean, all the people that the Torah mentions, that's described in the Torah, we don't know all the details about them. Every time the Torah tells us a detail about someone in the Torah, one of the people that the Torah writes about, there's a reason for it. What's the lesson within the lesson? Why are we being taught that Noach was a righteous man, but only in his generation? Because oftentimes we judge people when we shouldn't. And I think the first lesson here is don't judge people. Noach was a righteous man, only relative to his generation. And what that means is, when you see someone and they're not doing the perfect thing, they're not living the perfect life, you have no idea relative to their situation what high levels they're on, what levels of spirituality a person can reach, when it may seem to you that they're not observant at all of the commandments of mitzvot. It may seem to you that they're not in touch with God. You don't know what their situation is and where they stand relative to that situation. So, step one, don't judge people, because you don't know where they stand relative to their generation. Their generation, what I'm interpreting it as, meaning relative to where they find themselves in life. You know, I knew a guy once that he and I belonged to the same volunteer organization, and we would meet from time to time. I forgot how often it was, but let's suppose for the moment it was once a week, right? And we would meet once a week and do some volunteer work, and this guy would show up every week along with all the other volunteers to do his volunteer work. But every time there was a need to do some extra volunteer work, he would never be there. He only showed up to that once a week, again using that frequency as an example. He would only show up for whatever the regular meetings were, whatever the regular volunteering times were, but never anything beyond that. And it appeared as if the guy had no interest, right? And then one day I found out that what was going on was that this guy would skip lunch every time that he would come to a meeting, or he would come to whatever volunteering we were doing at that particular occasion. He would skip lunch that day so that he would have enough money for a bus fare or train fare to get there. That's what I mean, is don't judge a person. Relative to his situation, this guy really extended himself. Relative to his situation, this guy really sacrificed. So when someone is righteous in their own relative to their situation, you might not be aware of that. Don't judge. The other lesson is upon ourselves. Noach was righteous relative to his generation because he walked with God. Now, all of us should strive, obviously, to be the best person we can be. You should try to be reach the highest spiritual level that you can reach. You should try to observe the commandments as perfectly as possible. But is there a guarantee that you're going to be Avraham Avinu? You're going to be Abraham? Are all of us going to be Moses? Obviously, no. Not all of us are going to rise to those levels of perfection. In fact, in some cases, our situation may be obstacles to us. If you're not going to rise to those amazing levels, to those amazing heights, then don't let that stop you from trying. Go as high as you can. You know, Abraham was able to walk before God. Okay, you walk with God. You can't be Abraham, be Noach. I think that's the lesson here. The lesson is when you live in a situation, for example, if you live in a society that actually tries to outlaw Brit Milah, the ritual circumcision that is the core of the identity of a Jew. If you live in a society that tries to do that, make the best that you can out of that situation, living between people like that. If you live between a whole bunch of people that call you a bigot for pointing out the truth of the Torah, make the best out of that. Don't let them corrupt you. Continue believing what you believe. Continue to read that book, the Torah, and whatever it says, you believe, and don't let them corrupt you. Et Elokim mitalach Noach. Rely on God. Lean on Him for support. If you live in a day and age where your daughter is going to be forced to share a locker room with a guy, let her not use the locker room if possible. Make the best of the situation, but don't let it stop you from striving to be the best you can. No, I don't want to borrow the phrase from the Marines, be the best you can be. But don't let the obstacles and the situation that you live in, don't let it corrupt you. Don't get influenced by evil people around you. You live in a world where, in many cases, stealing is considered a virtue. It's considered business acumen. Don't let that corrupt you. You do the best you can, and in some cases you may fall. In some cases you may falter walking through such a tremendous obstacle course. But et Elokim et halach Noach. Try to be a Noach if you can't be an Abraham. Walk with God if you can't walk before Him. And once you arrive at that level that you thought you can't get past it, you'd be surprised. Walking with God, He may pick you up once in a while and put you over that obstacle, and then you continue walking with Him, and maybe you can reach bigger and better heights, as Rish Lakish said about him. When you find yourself in a different situation, imagine how much more of a higher level of spirituality, a higher level of closeness to God you can reach once you started out on that much lower step. Shabbat Shalom.